How's it guys, and welcome to session number 2 of our 15-part Soundcraft VI Masterclass. My name is Gabriel Roux, and today we're looking at show files and snapshots. We touched on it briefly in our previous session, but today we want to have a closer look at all the features that's available there. When it comes to the snapshots, we are doing another session later on where we are looking at all the finer details when it comes to snapshots. Today is getting a basic understanding of the show file and snapshots. We're going to jump over to the console quickly. This is our VI 1000 once again, and where do we find this on the console? I think some of you that's never had any experience on the VI might at this stage still feel a little bit disorientated. In the session to come, I'm talking about layout, so don't worry too much about that. When we go to show files, there's a menu button here, brings up our main menu, and our show tab is right there. Great, so we're going to jump over to the computer. This is the Soundcraft Virtual VI software, and this is basically a carbon copy of the software that runs on the console. So there's a few uses for Virtual VI. The scenario I'm running at the moment is a master and slave scenario. It's called mirroring, where I've got a network connection with my computer to the VI 1000, and the 1000 is the master and the PC is the slave. It just helps obviously with training. So basically exactly what's happening on the console will also then follow on the software. So that's me pushing up channel 8. I can mute and unmute it like that. Pushing the fader up and down on 8, and you'll see it's just mimicking there. So just to have an understanding, we're also going to have a session on this later on. So what we want to look at is obviously how to recall a show file. We're just going to recap this from last week. So obviously when we're loading a new show file, we want to start from scratch. We're going to use this little tab here called default shows. There's a few options here. Most of the VIs have only 2 starting show files. The one is front of house configuration and the other one is a monitor configuration. On the VI 1000 there is an exception that there's actually 4. There's the front of house and front of house 16 fader. The only thing that's different on the 16 fader is that we'll have inputs populated across both these banks. This is something we can manipulate on any of the consoles, but they've just done the work for us, and it'll go 1 to 8 and then 9 to 16 and so on and so forth. Great, so the option we're going to go with is called front of house. So we click on menu, then show, default shows at the top there, right at the top. Front of house, we're going to push the button called load. Whenever we push this button, it obviously gives us a little dialogue. Whenever a dialogue like this pops up, be careful to read it. Because it might ask you, do you want to delete your show file, and you're not reading it, or you were working on the console and you did something by mistake. Maybe you unpatched all your outputs, and now it's asking you whether you want to save, and you say yes. Now you're writing that mistake into your show file. And then the rest of the day is going to be interesting. So always read. Do you want to save change to currently loaded show? No, I don't want to do that. Say no. The next thing we want to do is to save it. We can't save over the main show. That's the one we're on now. So if I say save, it's going to say default show cannot be saved, because that is write protected. So we have to say save as. We're going to give it a name. Let's call it audio training number 1. Enter. And there it is. When we come to the bottom here, this is a very handy tool. We can arrange the show file by time or date. When you only have 3 shows like that, it doesn't really matter. But when you've got 100 of them, it can sometimes get difficult to find them. If the dates on your console is set correctly, then you'll be able to just toggle this to bring it right to the top. Then obviously we can delete it. So we can say delete that one. Do you want to delete? Say yes. And then we can also say save as. Call it version 2. There's a few other features when it comes to the show file that are maybe not as obvious and you won't see them, and that comes into the design of the console. There's a lot of the things we don't see because you have to do a certain action to get to them. It kind of comes down to the design of the console, trying to have the features that are really simple at the front, because a lot of these VIs go into churches where we're working with volunteers and we don't want to confuse them. So for instance, one of those is if we put a USB drive into this computer on the console, that's the USB ports there. I'm just going to pop it into the computer so you can see what happens. The second window pops up here. So now it gives us the option of also transferring this file here to a USB drive. Do you want to save changes? Do you want to save the show before exporting? We can say yes, that's fine. What's happening now? It's transferring the show from the console onto this drive. There it is. If I, for instance, want to bring this show in that says Harmon S1, we can just push this little button to bring it from the drive to here. Great. There's a few other things that have changed now. You'll see we can also arrange the date and the name on the drive by toggling the switch here, which is very handy. So we can quickly look at where this would lie on the drive. So if I go to my drive, here we go. Shows, there it is. There's the 3 shows that are on that specific drive. And if you look inside, there's our snapshots. At the moment it's empty. We can, however, create a snapshot. Save our show file. Save, yes. I want to export it again to the drive, which is this button here. It's asking me if I want to override. In this case I do. It's waiting for the process. Drive F shows snapshot. There we go. There are our snapshots. I have previously been able to transfer snapshots between shows. There was 2 identical shows and I accidentally deleted a snapshot and I wanted to bring it back. So what I did is I actually went in here, copied it, went to the other show and pasted it in to the right folder, and then loaded that onto the console and it worked 100%, which I guess is one of the advantages of having the offline editor. You can use this to build your show at home. It's obviously free, so you can just go onto the Soundcraft website and download the software, and then you can build and also edit old show files if you want to prepare them for a show. Or it's also a great tool to learn the console with just your computer at home. There's one other feature that I want just to mention is when it comes to labeling. So obviously we can use the offline editor to label our channels. Not a problem there, right? But what if we already have a patch list and we just want to copy our labeling that's on our patch list to what's happening on the console? Transfer that labels. How do we do that? Go menu again, show file. There's these 2 little buttons that allow us to export and import labels. So I'm going to quickly say export channel labels. Say yes. I'm going to close this. And then in the root of my USB drive called Gabs, and it's in the F. It's the F drive at the moment. We see this CSV file. There we go. So what you can do now, you can obviously open this in Excel as comma separated into columns and just copy your patch list into this position. So maybe we should make some changes here quickly. Call it kick. So something that's important to know is that we can't change the format here, right? We can just change the wording. So I've labeled kick, snare, hi-hat. Not that I ever only use one kick and one snare mic, but just for example. Now I can import those labels. You can only have one of these into the root of the flash drive at the moment, obviously, because the console is looking for that file name. Don't change this file name. Just leave it as it is. Let's say import channel labels. Let's say go down to the console. Kick, snare, and hi-hat. Oh, I don't know if you can read it here. Kick, snare, and hi-hat has changed. This labeling hasn't changed. So something to also note is the fact that if you want the long, so this is your long label and your short label refers to this. There's a long label and a short label. The long label is the one that comes up on this section here. And there's also a short label, which is the one here. When you connect your iPad, this is also the label that you're going to see. So you can think about it as the one is being a engineering label and the one is a user label. One is the engineering label and one is the user label. So if we want to change the user label, it's in the second column. It's this guy here. Also referred to as long label. So I'm going to take that out and make it kick 91. And I'm going to make channel input 2 snare 57. We're going to save this. File, save. Close that. Close that. Cancel. We don't want to power down. Input channel labels. Go. Let's have a look. There we go. Kick 91 and snare 57. This is also changed on the console. Great, wonderful. So nice little tool to use. So if you have written a patch list, you can then export, like I've done, the labeling. You can open it, open your Excel file, open it in Excel as comma separated, then copy from your patch list into the same format that we've just shown. Don't change anything else, just say save. Once you're done, import it and your labeling will be done. Great. Nice little tool to speed up the process. Other option is to obviously just label it on the software. Save your show and then bring it onto your console. The only thing, if you do it that way around, is to make sure that the version of the virtual VI or this offline editor that you're using is the same as the version of the software that's on the console. Great, so the next thing that we want to look at is snapshots. Just to locate it on the console is this section here. It's obviously labeled called snapshot control. We're going to jump back onto our offline editor or the virtual VI. So if we look at the offline editor, it's this section here. We've got a little setup button that opens up the window that pertains to our snapshots. We've got a button that says store. We push that, it creates a new snapshot. We can also, when we do a change, undo our last change if we accidentally saved it. So for instance, if we had that position there and we have done an update and we accidentally did that, we'll be able to undo it. So that fader down there will go down, undo. There's these two buttons that says last and next. That's just to skip between them. It's good to know is when you do that, it recalls the snapshot immediately as well. So it's like a select and go. Where the arrows, if you use the arrows, you can scroll up with the arrow to the specific snapshot that you want and then recall it. So they do have slightly different functions. I'm just going to make a few of them just to explain that. So recall. Then I can go down to this one called Q2. Great. So now we know how to make a snapshot. And there might be one or two of you that wonder, what in heaven's name is a snapshot and what's the difference between a show file and a snapshot? And that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it. So the show file is everything that's on the console. And the snapshot folder is within. So if you can imagine a folder sitting on your desktop with your show, so all your settings are in there, your input and output configuration, your cards, your stage rack configurations, and within that folder there's also another folder called Snapshots that is taking a photo of what's happening on the console. And I found this very, very cool presentation. This one, yeah. So this is looking at the fader, only the fader pages in different layers. But if you can imagine the fader pages and all the EQs and all the inputs all laid out in front of you. So at the moment we are seeing the console like this. So we're only seeing channel 1 to 8. We go to the next fader page. This one here, then it's 9 to 16, 17 to 24. So obviously what you can see is happening here is we're using layers to get to different places on the console. If you can imagine the console and all the inputs are laid out like an analog console, from channel 1 to 96 obviously be a massive console. All the EQs are laid out, all the compressions are laid out, and it's just this massive big thing. And we go and we take a photo of it, like we do that. We take a photo of that scenario, right? That is exactly what a snapshot is. It's going here, laying out the whole console, all the fader positions, where all these buttons are, all the EQs that we've done, like that. EQs, these compressors were on. There was some sends going, like that. And we want to take a photo of this whole business. All the ins and outs, fader position. Let's do that. Let's take a snapshot of that. Now we've created that. So if I go back to queue number 1, all of this will be gone. If I go to queue number 2, all of it's recalled. So that is a snapshot. Where do we use it? So the show files are set up, our labeling, all of that. Our snapshots is photos within our show file. And a prime example is if we're mixing a festival, we'll have one show file, but we'll have many snapshots for the band. Each band will have its own snapshot. So for instance, a scenario that we could have is, I'm just going to quickly delete all this nonsense. Delete, yes, create a store. So that can be, for instance, start, scene, which can also be a mute scene. We can make another one then and call it band 1. And another one, band 2. Ooh, my typing is really bad today. Band, or it's my eyes, one of the two. Great. That's the first one, second one, third one. At this stage they're all the same, but we can make changes. So if you pay attention to the fader positions at the bottom there, we can say that on the start one, the faders are all down. Update snapshot. On the second one, the fader positions were all relatively on 0. Update snapshot. And on this one, we were only using the first 4 faders. Update snapshot. So when we look at our different positions, there where the faders are up, 1, 2, 3, 4 is up. We can maybe mute those. Go to band number 1. There we go. So these are the different snapshots that we have taken. There we go. That's number 1. So you can see my hands are not on the console. I'm just recalling the snapshots on the virtual VI. Band 1, band 2. And this applies to every single thing on the console. Our labeling, where our gain settings is. There's features on the console called isolate that allows us to choose what we want to recall and what we not want to recall. We also have something called a scope. I'll show it to you now, where we can also exclude certain things out of that recall data, or what we've taken, photo we've taken, snapshot we've taken. So let's quickly have a look at that. Okay. This is the layout of our snapshot. So what you've seen up to now is very easily, if I want to save the state that the console is in, so say for instance, that fader needs to be down, channel 4 needs to be down, channel 7 needs to be down, and I want to save this snapshot. I just hit store. There it is, cue number 4. And I can call it, I don't know, let's say it was called an alternative band. Obviously you'll label these with the correct names. There's a few other things that we can change. Obviously the naming is right there. We can make a new cue there. It's exactly the same button as this. We can also duplicate 2 snapshots. So if, say for instance I was mixing this band here, right, all the faders were up like that, and now we get another band and we go like, oh, okay, this band is actually quite similar to that band that I previously had. So I can quickly recall that and say duplicate, and then recall our duplicated scene, and then start from there instead of starting from scratch. The band like that. Great. Another feature is obviously to be able to move these around. So say we want to put them in order, we can say move it down to there. You can also use this rotary right here on the console to move it up and down if you want to. So I can say the band is going to be the first band to play, or right after our start scene. Drop it there, drop. And we want to also say band 1, we sound check them first, but they're actually playing last. Our start scene is obviously the 1 where all the faders are down. It's basically a mute scene. Let's actually do that. Unmute all the faders. Say update yes. We maybe want to move that so we've got a mute scene at the end as well. So we can say duplicate, move that down all the way to the bottom, drop it. Great. Then once again, there's a lot of things that you're not seeing at the moment, and I'm going to touch on 1 or 2 of them. But when we have our in-depth snapshot session, I'll go through this step by step. So if this is something that interests you, be sure to catch that one. For instance, if I push up here, I've now deactivated all my snapshots, and they will do absolutely nothing, just something to be careful for. So there's a lot of these features that you won't know about if you don't know about them, and they're kind of hidden for that reason. If a pro engineer is using the console and we may be running a scenario where this specific snapshot is being recalled by a MIDI trigger, I want to be able to momentarily switch it off or switch off the MIDI control there. There's also a scope. When I talk about isolations, I'm also going to talk about what a scope is. In essence, whatever is green in the scope is what we're recalling. So for instance, if I undo the EQ, whenever we recall that start scene, we're recalling everything but not the EQs. This is a global one for all the EQs. We can also go into the channels and say, okay, cool, we don't want to recall a specific channel for some reason. I don't often use scopes, but they're there to use. So for instance, if I say none, I've basically broken the snapshot and it's not doing anything anymore. So I can now recall that one there. The little faders are up. If I go to the start scene now, absolutely nothing's going to happen. The fader positions stay exactly where they are because I've deactivated all the metadata that's there. I can go and switch it back on like that. When I recall the snapshot now, you're going to see these faders are going to pop down. Recall. Great. So if you ever work on a VI and the snapshot's not recalling the way it should, first thing to check is to check the scope. It's normally hidden, which I feel is safe because you can accidentally push things there. Second thing to check is this bar at the top there. It's part of the touchscreen. If you select that, then none of these snapshots will work anymore. We will later on come back to this. There is sub-menus. There's also a way of processing all our snapshots. So if we have a specific change that we want to make over all our snapshots, there's a little tool that we can use to do that. I'm going to talk about that in the snapshot session. Then also each of these little blocks, it's got a sub-menu like that. The first one refers to our timecode, if we want to trigger something via MIDI timecode. The second one refers to our UAD snapshot information. Something that's good to know at this stage is how to make a note, so we can say it's important to get the mic on. So you'll see this little note there now. Oh, let me just scroll down. There it is. Important. Mic on. Also fade times. We'll touch on that in a second because I believe that is something you would want to do. Just a basic feature. We can also recall a snapshot with a MIDI trigger, and this is actually something I've used quite a lot. So if you're connecting more than one console, or if it's consoles from different manufacturers, you can use a MIDI note to recall a snapshot, and obviously the snapshot will put the console in a certain state. It's under this tab there, and you can also switch it on and off there. And then lastly is GPIOs. We can use GPIOs to recall a certain snapshot. There's also one other feature that we can maybe touch on now, and that is how to black out a snapshot. Just quickly skipping slightly back. Fade times are extremely important, especially when we're mixing either in a church scenario where we're doing a front of house mix and also in-ear mix from the same console, or if you're the monitor engineer and there's in-ears available, or if you're going from a snapshot where everything is muted to where everything is live. It can be quite a big difference to go from this scenario where everything is muted like that to where everything is on like that. Of course, the console is just snapping there, right? Quickly. So I want to be able to apply these changes over time, and for that we need a fade time. So how do we do that? It's in this little block there. So I'm just going to go back to, I'm going to recall my start scene, and then this one called the band, everything's on. Perfect scenario, great. So I'm going to switch on the fade time on both of these. I normally use 1.5 seconds as a rule. So what's going to happen now is there's going to be 1.5 seconds difference in settings between these two snapshots. You can see the changes being applied at the bottom there. Let's have a look at what that looks like. So this is my mute scene, and it's fading in. Then the other thing to pay attention to when you use fade times is the switches. When do you want the switches to switch from on to off? Do you do it in the beginning, in the middle, or at the end of the fade? So my rule normally here is, obviously if it's going from a mute scene to a band scene where everything is on, the switches need to first switch on and then fade in. When we are going to the end to our mute scene after the show, the fade first needs to happen and then the switches. So in this scenario, it's in our mute scene, it's going to band, so it's going to switch on and then fade in. Right, that's our mute scene, goes to switches on and then fade in. Perfect. Then if we go to the last one at the end, which is going to be a mute, it needs to be the other way around. So we want a fade time as well. Great. But we want the switches to happen at the end. Recall. Oh, lovely. Let's see what that looks like. So I'm going to go to the first one. That's our first scene recalled. It's exactly the same, so you're not seeing a change. Everything is muted. We're going to the first band, so the switches need to switch on and then fade in. Great. Then we go to our mute scene right at the end, which is going to have to fade out and then switch off. Great. This is a very handy tool to use. I always use fades. I find a good time to use is between 1 second and 1.5 seconds. Obviously, the bigger the session, maybe the more time you want to give it, except if it's changes that need to happen quicker. So, for instance, a guy takes the vocal takes to one mic and moves to another mic. That can obviously not be a long fade because you might miss the cue. So consider basically what the changes are and how quickly it should happen. But as a rule of thumb, 1 second or 1.5 seconds seems to do the job. This is great also for in-ears. That's why I've mentioned it, because if you're standing backstage and the band's playing, as they always do, but not everything is muted, it gives you a massive fright when you just unmute everything in the ears. It's nice when it gradually comes in. So maybe in a church scenario, you can make the snapshot going from your mute to your first scene or your live scene very, very, very long. Great. So it gives the musicians a bit of a warning that we're coming in. Great. So now the last thing I want to mention about fades is the fact that the fade actually crossfades everything. It's not just the fader positions, but also where our EQs are, what dynamics we're using, if there's changes within the dynamics, and obviously most important, any sends that are happening. So any sends sending to auxes, maybe sending to in-ears or monitors. So I'm just going to recall this on the console, but we're going to just monitor it on virtual VI. So this is my mute scene. As you can see, also all of that is crossfading, which is wonderful. This is a standard feature. You don't have to go and set it anywhere. It's set up like that from the get-go. Great. So fades are awesome. Use them. Then one last thing that I want to mention in this session is there's the little blackout. This happens every now and then, that you're in a scenario, for instance, like a theater that's very small, and the director asks for a full blackout. So that includes everything, all the lights, everything needs to be dark, including the console. So the console does have a feature that allows you to dim the screen a little bit. At the moment I'm running it on low just to help the camera. But it's only high, medium and low, and even the low is still, there's quite a lot of light still here because of the screens and these little screens here. So how do we do that? So obviously option number one is to put a cloth over. That's the low-tech option. The console does have a feature though that allows us to put a blackout. There's two ways of approaching this problem. The one is just to go to the scene that you want to use. Let's say it's the scene here. You click this little box and you say blackout on. Now if you recall, the console will do a blackout. This is obviously something I'm going to have to demonstrate here. So I'm going to go to second snapshot, switch it on. When we recall the mute scene and we go live, everything goes dark. So the audio is still passing. If you look close, you'll still be able to see the reading. And how do we get out of this state? F6. There's a second way of doing this, which I normally, is the way that I do it, is I will duplicate my scene. So the scene I'll duplicate it. On the first one, I'll have the blackout in, and on the second one, I'll have the blackout out. I'm going to do the same here, say duplicate. So this is our mute scene. Wonderful. Go to band live with the blackout. You can even do it prior if you want to. And then go to our next scene. And then be back. You'll pay attention to these little lights are on, and to cancel the blackout you push F6. So great, nice little feature to use, especially in a small theater scenario where you have to do a complete blackout. You can also prank your friends with that if they don't have a bad heart. Great, so that's everything for today's sessions. If you guys want to ask any questions about what we've done, anything that I've demonstrated that is not 100% clear, now's your chance. Anything I need to explain on the console concerning a show file or a snapshot or anything on the offline editor, we can go through it again. We've got a few minutes, so ask your questions now.